Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Jane and I am here as part of my solo month in Naples. I haven't even really unpacked. You can see it's all still very, very bare behind me. But I thought that I would come on here and talk about my sort of few days that I had in Venice on the way out here, and particularly my trip to the Fortuny Museum in Venice. Now, I went to the Fortuny Museum many, many years ago, and it stayed with me as a museum with such a sense of place. And then the last time that I was in Venice, it was closed for renovations. So this time it was top of my list to go to. And then, even more excitingly, as I was doing some reading around before going, I noticed that the V&A Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, had recently altered the description on its Delphos dresses. Now, the Delphos dresses are, I think, seen as sort of the flagship product by the Fortuny brand. It had altered the designer credit on them. It was no longer Mariano Fortuny, but it was Henriette Negrin, who was his wife. As soon as I read that, they changed it in 2021. As soon as I read that, I thought, this is going to turn out to be one of those things, another one of these examples where a woman's work has been erased, and where we need to just start pulling at the threads and also sharing the correct story, because it's very difficult when there is so much information already out there, because those Delphos dresses are really popular. So lots of fashion books write about them, lots of art books write about them. We need to start sharing the new findings. So today I'm going to be talking about the Fortuny Museum, Mariano Fortuny, because he's absolutely at the sort of like the core of what was happening, but also particularly Henriette Negrin and her textile design work. So let's start with Mariano Fortuny. He was born in 1871. He was Spanish aristocrat. The aristocracy, he was right, he goes back generations and generations, fabulously wealthy, amazing contacts. His particular family were known for being artistic. His father was a painter, his grandfather was a painter. It was assumed that he would become a painter. It is this really privileged kind of ancestry. However, his father died when he was 3, and his mother decided that rather than continue to live in Spain, she would rather go to Paris and live near her brother. So the whole family moved to Paris. They got a house on the Champs-Élysées, and that is where Mariano Fortuny grew up. And he was brought up being educated to be a painter. He went to lots of ateliers, he was apprenticed to artists. He was in Rodin's studio for a while. But actually, this didn't go particularly well. He wrote himself that he found all of the beginning kind of exercises that you do as an artist to be really dull. He didn't like copying old master paintings. He had all of these ideas. He had some facility in painting. He wanted to be able to run with that. He didn't want to have to sit down and learn. And all through his life, you can see this. It's just so many ideas, so much energy. But when he was in his teens particularly, this seems to have caused problems. It didn't go with the education that his family had thought about. So by the time he's sort of in his late teens, his mother has decided to move to Venice. And she takes a palazzo, or I don't know whether she buys it, I don't know whether she rents it, but anyway, the family go to live in a palazzo on the Grand Canal. So again, it is somewhere that is going to be, very expensive. It's very well connected. She loved entertaining. She was, and I just think this is hilarious, she was a great collector of antique textiles. She loved, in particular, 15th and 16th century textiles. The more sumptuous, the better. She loved silk brocades. She loved woven velvets in these sumptuous colours. And she would entertain a lot. And after dinner, her kind of performance, because, after dinner performances were an essential part of your dinner party. Her performance would be that a massive chest, like a wooden chest, would be brought into the room, and then very carefully, helped by one of her daughters, she would bring out these amazing bits of fabric for everybody to ooh and ah over, and then she would paste them over the backs of chairs, things, and then at the end she would carefully put them all back in the box and it would be taken away. I was saying that, it made me realise how wide these sort of performances interests could be. I think that I'd probably be the only person in my friend group that would really want to do that. So anyway, she moves to Venice. Mariano moves with her. But at this time, he has become really obsessive about theatre set design, theatre lighting. He had gone with family friends to some theatre performances in Paris, and he had been able to see behind the scenes, and that captured his imagination about how you could create light and shade on the stage, how you could completely change the way that the spaces were lit to give different atmospheres. And coming from this very wealthy, incredibly well-connected family, where they had friends who were wealthy enough to be putting on private performances, he was invited to experiment with these lighting techniques on real projects. So when he was living in Venice in, sort of the 1890s, he also took a large studio in Paris where he could experiment with his theatre techniques, and he took the massive third floor of what is now the Fortuny Museum. At that point, it was a palazzo which was not being used as a palazzo. It was lots of small workshops. And Fortuny was able to get the third floor, which was a massive big room in the middle, and really high ceilings, such a good space if you're wanting to build theatre sets. And then sort of smaller rooms off the edge that would work as, libraries or smaller working spaces. And at the time that he moved into that, there were 300 other artisans working in the building. Within a few years, they were no longer working in the building, and he had the whole space. This isn't queried at all in any of the literature, but that sounds slightly suspicious to me, that it's faster than natural wastage would have been. But there we go. He starts off with the third floor, and he's commuting backwards and forwards from Venice to Paris. Now, in 1902, he met Henriette Negrin, who was much later to become his wife. If you read biographies of him, there's lots of it is suggested that she was an artist model kind of phrases. There's absolutely no evidence that she was an artist model. And the phrase is there, I believe, because there is a particular kind of art historian whose personal life experience is that the way women marry, particularly the way they marry artists or people who are more wealthy than they are or better connected, is by offering sex. And there is a big correlation in our collective imagination between artist model and prostitute. And the suggestion that women have been working as artist models and have met their future husbands as artist models is just a way of tarnishing a reputation before we even started. Now, many things to unpack there, which I don't have time for here, but I say it's very unlikely that they met because she was working as an artist model. She was 21. She had recently been divorced. She'd been married to a painter. She came from that kind of hotel owner, shop owner kind of background. Her brother, I think, was a painter. She grew up in Fontainebleau, which was a very popular destination for painters going out day trips. Fortuny wasn't particularly interested in painting at this time. He was very much obsessed with his theatre sets and so on. But we don't know how they met, but they definitely met. And I don't think that what drew them together was sex. What I think drew them together was that they both loved experimenting, finding out how to get things to work, creating new things, engineering, creativity, coming together to create something new. And all through their life, from this point, you can see that is, they're working so closely together in the same space, talking together about things, coming up with ideas. But I do believe they have, completely different projects that they're working on. And I think that's, it's a meeting of minds. And, 1902, there probably weren't that many women who would have been that interested in engineering projects. So, Henriette moves with Mariano back to Venice. They do not stay in his mother's house on the Grand Canal. Instead, they move into sort of a space within his workshop. And, there's not that much evidence here, but people do mention, it was this kind of very cozy, domestic, pared back kind of life where Henriette was doing the dishes and making the beds and doing sewing, but where most of their time was spent creating in the big spaces. And then they just had the small end rooms as their domestic space. So quite a different life, but also one that chimes with all of these artist communities that were sort of like late 19th century, like the Morrises, this idea that you would get together and be creating spaces where you could live and work and make new things and a new way of living. So they lived in Venice in this workshop. They travelled a lot. They went to Greece. They collected lots of books and photographs and images. They drew. They were coming up with ideas the whole time. You can see this kind of like headiness in their time. And they had been to Greece in sort of like the early 1900s. And there, Henriette had been taken very much by some costumes, chariot driver costumes, very finely pleated, that were on, I think, pottery, and she had made sketches of those. And they'd also made sketches of lots of little motifs. There was a lot of archaeological finds at this time, and they bought the big kind of expensive books and they copied out the motifs and things. And then they had this idea that they would set up in this massive workshop a printing space where they could print onto enormously long scarves. Now, enormously long scarves were already fashionable. There was an American dancer called Louis Fuller who performed at the Folies Bergère in Paris. And she was best known for a thing called the scarf dance. And I think that she'd actually looked back to kind of like the 18th century and, Emma Hamilton's dances, but she did these amazing swirling dances with really long scarves. And she was so popular that, she was immortalized in ceramics and lamps and things. So, not surprisingly, these long scarves became really popular with people who would never be doing any dancing with them. And that was what Henriette and Mariano were intending to make. And there are some photos of Henriette in her long scarf with lots of Minoan kind of designs were done with wood blocks. It's a lovely picture of her painting the wood blocks before printing them. And you can see in this how much, I think this gives such a good feeling of the space at that time. There she is in her workshop coat, which is clearly well worn, well used, even just in the couple of years. And this isn't a dilettante. It's not somebody who is playing at things. This is somebody who is a worker working things out. And at some point, she has gone back to her sketchbooks, and particularly this sketch of the chariot driver in a pleated kind of chiton. And she must have said to herself, that would be a really easy to wear outfit. I wonder how I would make it. It's pleated silk. How do you keep the pleats in? How do you have that many pleats going around? And nobody knows quite how she did it. There is a patent, was filed in 1909, and it was filed by Mariano Fortuny, but there is a note on the side that the patent actually belongs to Henriette and that it is her design. This is the kind of thing, there will have been hundreds, thousands possibly, of researchers who have looked at that, who have been trying to work out how this machine works, who have ignored that note on the side that very, very clearly says that she is the designer. And they then happily wrote that Mariano Fortuny created this machine, created the Delphos dress, created the brand. I find it slightly baffling. Anyway, so nobody quite knows how the machine worked, because when you do a patent, you just have to put the machine up and you don't have to say how it actually works. But there are a couple of things that I've noticed when reading around that I think may hold the secret to that, or particularly what started her thinking along these lines. The first is somebody described it as being like a mechanical gophering iron. Now, a gophering iron is a way of putting pleats into something. It's a domestic thing. You'd have your iron and things. You'd have your gophering iron, which allowed you to put pleats back into collars and things. You can get them dating back to Elizabethan times, to wonderful ruffs. But in the late 19th century to the 20th century, they were something that was taught to every French schoolgirl how to put pleats into surplices in church. I mean, just so much so that in the 1950s at finishing school, lots of upper class English gals learned how to use gophering irons on priest surplices because the curriculum was so dated. But my point is that she would have known how to use heat and steam to put temporary pleats into fabric. So what she has done is she has connected that, which gives you sort of like this kind of pleat, an outwards kind of thing, into a tube, making, well, it wasn't really a tube, it was sort of like lengths of fabrics that could then be made into a tube. And in doing that, she created this dress, which was known as the Delphos dress. So it is 4 straight pieces of finely pleated fabric stitched together. There are lots of different varieties. They are held sort of like to the body with strings inside, so that it does have some kind of shape. And then the fastenings are Mariano glass beads. Sometimes the fastenings are down the side, sometimes they're front, sometimes there is a drawstring top. And then they would be dyed, and that would be your dress. Now, as a practical dress, I think it's quite interesting because what was this dress for? In some early images, Henriette, sort of like in the prototype images, Henriette has it worn with long evening gloves, as though it would be the kind of thing that you go out to the theatre in. Later, there are pictures of her out hiking in the Dolomites, and she's in her Delphos dress. And when they're I don't know, they look like cork sandals. They're certainly flat little kind of sandals that she's wearing. She's actually out for a walk in this dress. They were marketed when they became something that could be sold as more of a kind of a tea dress, the kind of thing that you would wear in that afternoon period where you weren't going to be corseted. So between sort of lunch and dinner, women often entertained at home. It would just be friends and close family that would see them, and they would wear something that wouldn't have corsets underneath. So they kind of like were marketed as that. And then there was a separate kind of marketing towards dancers and so on. The main problem, as I see it, is that this dress, if you get it wet, the pleats come out. So any cleaning had to be done by sending it back to the Fortuny shop. It would then be cleaned, which would remove all of the pleats, and it would have to be repleated. So if you think about sort of the kind of life of a dress, you couldn't get it wet. So I think that hiking in the Dolomites would be quite difficult because presumably you would get it all wet down the bottom. If you dropped anything on it, you wouldn't be able to clean it without this constant ferrying backwards and forwards. And there is some very interesting kind of chemical analysis of Delphos dresses in collections because they're often in a really, really grubby state, but they cannot be easily cleaned without damaging the pleats. So there we are. So, however, this Delphos dress became the centre of the Fortuny brand. And, Mariano, continued doing his theatre stuff. He designed lights. He was doing massive murals in his house, which are kind of slightly disturbing. And, this kind of, it was a room for relaxing in after dinner, you know, lots of low couches and cushions and things. And here you have all of these naked women on the walls. It's very, very similar to all of those sort of 19th century British artists like Alma Tadema or Frederick Leighton in this, you know, supine, asleep, naked women. Anyway, kind of irrelevant. So what happens is that with all of the connections that Mario has, I suspect with his very flamboyant character, the Delphos dresses begin to sell. And they need to have a kind of collection around it. Partly because the Delphos dresses sell particularly well to older women. They are flattering. They are less fussy. They allow movement, things. But they are possibly a bit too revealing. So you get a new range of things that are tunics and jackets and things, which are all designed to be worn with the Delphos dress. So the Delphos dress becomes this kind of, well, not an undergarment, but the first layer that you would have on. And then you might have tunics and scarves and things that would cover your arms and kind of things. You become this walking work of art because each layer is printed or embroidered things, and it becomes really elaborate. So here we are, and here are some more photos of the Museo Fortuny. And I would say if you're in Venice, do go and see it because it is quite spectacular. But while you're going around, remember that Henriette is not just a muse. She is an inventor, a designer, a creator. And I will see you next week. Bye-bye.